Alright, in this last video, I want to talk about reverb in spatialization. But first I want to go back and let's talk about what we have talked about. First of all, we spoke about sound, the science of sound. And I hope I approached that in a way that made it easy to understand and so that you could approach it and get a basic understanding and some direction to enhance your knowledge in that area. Meaning that, how sound is, from what's causing sound to what is actually causing the acoustical sound, and figure out its acoustical properties, the transducers that may be propagating it, how it propagates through air, and what, how it may go about doing that. What kind of inductors might be receiving it, your ear or the microphone, and how that's affecting it to the end result of your brain, and how it's perceiving what has happened to it from the beginning of the process to the end of the process. And that is a whole nother type of signal flow, and a huge part of signal flow. It's starting from the basic properties of sound and everything that can happen to it all along the way, all the way to the end product of, what it's coming out of, what type of inductor for you to listen to it. So I hope I approached that well and gave a basic kind of outlay of that and opened up some doors for you to enhance your knowledge there and give you some good basic understandings of that. And the second thing I wanted to talk about, address, was the second part would be B, and actually acoustics. Acoustics, when you're dealing with that, talking about room acoustics and things like that, spatializations, and those type of concepts. I hope I approached that in a way that made it easy to understand, and I want to reiterate it and approach that again to where, there's two ways to really look at that. And if you come at it from the point of view to where you have two ways to approach that acoustical aspect, of spatialization in that regard, is that first of all, is that you're trying to, not have any spatialization, and you're trying to use your microphone to capture as clean as possible without any type of, anything else being in the capture, because you're going to do your spatialization in the DAW. Any type of with impulse responses and room reverbs, distortions and noise, and whatever else you might put in there to enhance the spatialization and the sound of that. With delays, we talked about delays, we talked about pannings, spatial pannings, and delaying one side from the other, and detunings and all that kind of stuff. That those all kinds of things that are part of that process of building that spatialization, and trying to get a cleanest capture possible without any effect, as little effect from the room as possible, almost like amniotic chamber. That that's one way to perceive it, and the other way is that the room is actually got a frequency response and an impulse response that is going to enhance that sound. But that's part of the production and capture. And for that to work for you, that, things that have to be taken into consideration, things that are going to absorb the sounds, things that are going to diffuse the sound, ways to enhance reflections, to enhance the room, take the qualities of the room and enhance that so that, it's, built up, in a bigger way, for that it is actually a part of the capture. So you're looking at it that way, as it's part of the vocalist, or it's part of the instrument, and you're building that room into the capture that you're putting onto the wave file. And if you look at it those two ways, because that spatialization in that room can affect tonal qualities with the frequency response, the absorptions and the diffusions and the reflections, and the delays that happen in that context can enhance the sound of what you're working with, and can, give it, this cool sound, it can build upon it, give it body, and give it, character, and all kinds of things like that, and the microphone inductor itself is another aspect of that that's really is it going to capture that well? Or is it going to work well if you're looking at it from the other perspective, to where you want as clean a capture as you can and you don't want any interference? Is your microphone going to get that clean capture with as little frequency response or as little distortion or noise in it as possible, so that you can work with something very clean in the studio? So if you look at those two things from that perspective, the first thing we talked about sound and the science of sound. I hope I approached that well. And the second thing is the actual, spatialization and acoustics from that perspective, and the two ways you should look at it and what those tools are. And if you look at it very basically and simply like that, and come at it from one of those two approaches or one of those two ways, that you will find that, getting your capture the way you want it is much simpler and much easier to understand for you, and becomes, a much better capture very quickly. So I hope I approached that quite well. And, materials in the room are going to affect the sound, and we talked about that. So I hope I approached that well, to where it made it easy to understand and a subject for you to approach and to work through. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is reverbs. And we talked a little bit about reverbs, but the biggest thing about reverbs is, let's actually look at what a reverb does in what we're doing and the transducers that the sound's coming from. That, first and foremost, that a reverb's delay. So you're basically trying to get delay coming back. You've got a sound, and then it's going to get delays. Does that make sense? It may be cascading delays from different reflections, and in delays of reflections, and but that's basically what it is. And there can be character to that in the dampness and the population of reflexivity, and all kinds of aspects that can actually add character to that sound. And you really kind of got to look at it that way, because when you're approaching the reverb, if you look at it like, that it's a delay coming back at you, and that's very simple concept. And you've got multiple delays coming back at you that are adding reverb, that's adding spatialization, and to look at it from that perspective on a plane, that it's reverb coming back at you, multiples, one hit you once, hit you twice, hit you 3 times, hit you 4 times, that's cascading back at you. And the second aspect of reverb is the tonal qualities and how it can affect the character. Sometimes in simple room reverbs or a very simple reverbs, that character can really cause issues with it. But sometimes in things like convolution reverb, that you can get impulse responses from very nice rooms that are going to have a nice frequency response and a nice impulse response that is going to add character to that sound. So it's a sculpting tool that is going to add some body and some character or some aspects, for the same reason that you would go record in that beautiful hall or that beautiful room at the studio. It's going to add, it's going to color it. It's like a beautiful color, that's adding some character and color to a sound that you've been sculpting. So if you really look at reverb like that in the very simplistic way like that it'll be a much better tool for you to build spatialization, and you'll find you use a lot less of it. Different types of reverbs, plate reverbs, spring reverbs, whatever kind of reverb you're dealing with, that those can add character to the sound. So really trying to look at it as a sculpting tool. First of all, look at it as its delay. So it's building body, because you're getting cascades of delay back at you. And try to keep it that simple in your mind. Is that what it's going to do, through those transducers coming out to your ears? And the second thing to do is look at it as it's a sculpting tool, that different types of reverbs and different impulse responses with different frequency responses or different impulse responses are going to add character, to that sound, as a sound sculpting tool, and really look at it that way. And you will find that the reverb becomes much easier for you to use, and that you're much better at using it the way that it should be used. That you will find that a lot of times you get this, They'll say this is a really cool room and this impulse frequency response, or you're talking about this huge studio. Well, if you just, one of the things that I really push is that, well, you can hear its reverb, back off. I can hear something's happening, but I don't really sure, you're about there. You might want to push it just a little bit, but not much. And you'll find that that's that character that builds that sound, that you're sound sculpting with that tool then. And then you just got to be real careful that the delays aren't overpowering that character. That means that you've got too much delay but enough character. You've got just enough character but too much delay, or you've got too much character and not enough delay. And so you're trying to find somewhere in between there to make those two things come together, to make the character, to build on the character of that instrument or sound that you're working on. And if you approach it that way, you will find that you use the reverb much better, and it's actually way more effective in your production. And the other thing is that normal reverbs, there's lots of different reverbs, very simple reverbs, some complex, some really super complex reverbs. There's a lot of free reverbs that are really cool in comparison to some ones that you can buy that are garbage, because they're just not going to do all the stuff that they say they're going to do. It's, it's just not, it's like if you could, it's not going to reproduce out of that guy's cheap earbuds or your cheap, computer monitors, or even your monitors, that you might be better off approaching it with other tools that are more simplistic, that are doing those two things well for you. One other aspect that I wanted to approach with that is that, reverbs that are dealing with things like spatializations like this. So you're talking about plane and asymmetry, and you're talking about distribution, height and width and all kinds of stuff. A lot of these things, dampness, population, reflexivity, are going to add character, but it really depends. Because when you're looking at those, you really got to understand that dampness and reflexivity and all that, what, off of what? It's going to make a difference of how it affects the character and what character that it puts on that sound. So take that in consideration, that, different types of material are going to add different character sounds to that sound as reverberation and delays cascading back at you. So think about that. So when you're looking at those parameters, that's very obvious to you, and you understand that, and really understand when you're messing with this kind of stuff that, you're not just wasting your time in something that ain't never going to get heard anyway. Really look at it and, use it on some things, and go back and listen to it at different settings and things like that. And then in a mix, did it really do that for you? Or did it, did it do it a little bit, or was it waste of time and garbage? Really look into that. And the other thing I wanted to say is that one thing about some reverbs and impulse responses for if you're recording vocals, if you got a vocalist and then you run their vocals through an amp simulator with an impulse response that has a nice frequency response of this great room and with a great impulse response, and it does wonders for his voice. Well, that can be very true sometimes if you go at it with a little bit, sprinkling it on there and don't overdoing it too much. And same with guitar amplifiers and simulators, sims, and the impulse responses and frequency responses you can put on there. Just be real careful that you go light with it. Does that make sense? And look at it the way that I'm showing you, how I'm having you look at reverb and spatialization that way. Because when you get done doing all this other work that you've done for you've looked at your spatialization, like we talked about, with your pannings and your delays and your detunings and all that you're working on your your stereo field and the spatializations of that are acoustically part of that. By the time you get done doing all that and you start working with the reverb, that it should be a much simpler thing for you to approach, and the tool should be approached as something that's sprinkled on there to enhance it, rather than, every now and then it is, you get this drum up, bam, and you want reverb, or something. I can understand that. But a lot of times it's just not that way, and those kind of things are very specific for very specific applications that you need to look into of what's happening there and do some actual sound sculpting. But the reverb is still the same thing, and you have to approach it the same way of what it's doing. So I hope I approached this whole concept very well and basically to open up some doors so that you can get what you need out of it and research what you need and have a much better way of understanding your mixes. Peace, hope, love.